My name is Perry, and welcome to the Literary Knitterary. Okay friends, I am here today with very fluffy hair to film my September wrap-up and possibly also a little bit of an October TBR. I don't really have a set TBR for the month, and by the time I try to make one, I won't be able to get it out before mid-month anyway, so I thought I would just give you a quick little update at the end about the types of books I'm going to be trying to read in October. So sort of broad strokes TBR, if you will. So in September, I read 10 books for a total of 3,597 pages, which is an average of roughly 120 pages per day, which means that I did meet my goal of increasing my pages per day to 100 or more, and that is an average of 360 pages per book. The average age of books I read was about 12.4 years, but the mode release year was 2020. In terms of genre, I read 4 speculative fiction books, 2 historical fiction books, 2 romances, 1 YA contemporary, and 1 play. In terms of age category, 3 of the books, or 30%, were targeted towards young adults and the rest towards adults. And something new, where I got the books, 7 of them were ebooks from my library, 2 were physical books from my library, and 1 was free on Project Gutenberg. So without any further ado, let's get into reviewing the books themselves. The first book that I read in September was Fire by Kristin Cashore. This is the loose sequel to Graceling, or the second book in the Graceling series. So this book follows a new protagonist, the eponymous Fire, and she lives in the Dells, which is a kingdom separated by mountains from the other kingdoms where Graceling took place. And in this land, they don't have Gracelings, but they do have monsters, which are like different versions of all of the animals that they have, and the way that they're different from regular versions of those things is that they're brightly colored and supernaturally beautiful and compelling and vicious. And Fire is the only human monster in the world, basically. So she is also very beautiful, very charming, and she has the power to control people's minds if she chooses to, which makes her both very powerful and constantly in danger from other people. Now for the actual plot of the book, Fire's father, who was also a human monster, was directly involved in the sort of corruption of the previous king of the land and the sort of destabilization of the kingdom. While this was taking place, these 2 other lords started planning a coup, basically. Now that king is dead and his son is on the throne, and Fire's father is dead, and she is basically determined never to use her powers so that she doesn't turn out to be a bad guy like her father was. Basically, this book is partially a villain origin story for the villain from Graceling, partially a love story, and partially about Fire sort of growing into herself, learning to see the world in shades of gray instead of just absolutes, learning to accept love, and learning how to safely use her power in order to help the kingdom and its people. I like this series pretty well. One of the things that I like about them, and I think one of their sort of defining characteristics, is that they are very much explicitly and intentionally feminist fantasy books. So they deal with issues that you often see sort of glossed over in fantasy, but that are kind of important logistical questions for like people who have uteri. So for example, all of the books discuss contraception and menstruation, which I think is not common in fantasy novels, and Fire in particular also discusses other issues surrounding like reproductive rights and pregnancy and children and so forth. So I enjoy these. I think they're a lot of fun, but I wouldn't say that they changed my life necessarily. I did enjoy the romance in Fire more than I liked the romance in Graceling. I think it has more of an enemies to lovers slow burn vibe with more sort of mutual pining, and I say the more pining the better. Okay, so the other person who lives here came home and wanted to eat dinner and other such unreasonable requests, so I have relocated here to the bedroom and will be carrying out the rest of these reviews in front of this fantastically colorful background. Anyway, it wasn't directly after Fire, but I did also read Bitterblue by Kristin Cashore this month, which I thought would complete the series, but it turns out that Kristin Cashore is releasing a new Graceling book like 8 years after the series was complete, and also the covers all got redesigned and they are very, very pretty. But yeah, for 8 years this was the last book in the trilogy, and like the other 2, it follows a new POV character, a new protagonist. This time it is Bitterblue, who is the young queen of Monsey. I'm going to try to describe this in a way that does not spoil the book Graceling, but it's going to be difficult to do, so if you're planning to read Graceling for the first time soon, maybe skip ahead like 10 seconds. Okay, so basically Bitterblue's country of Monsey is trying to rebuild and heal after years of mind control and memory altering magic were used to essentially enforce tyranny. And basically the plot is set in motion when Bitterblue realizes that the things her advisors are telling her don't necessarily add up, so she decides to go see for herself and starts sneaking out of the palace at night to observe her capital city herself. And the more she does this, the more it seems like the information she's getting doesn't match the reality of her kingdom, and of of course she's upset by this because she wants to be a good queen and help people. So in some ways this is a fantasy dealing with a lot of the same themes almost as 1984, where you have questions of what the truth is and who's manipulating the truth and what sort of the best path forward is when all of your records have clearly been doctored and manipulated and it's hard to get to facts. Basically, the central question of the book is about how in the present to deal with a history of wrongdoing and harm that had been carried out on a societal level, how the society can deal with and move forward from that. I really enjoy stories about trying to solve a mystery from the past, to find out the truth of the past, and so there were a lot of parts with like solving ciphers and decoding things and solving riddles that I really enjoyed. Again, I think these books are fun but not life-changing, but I probably will be reading the final book in this, I guess, quartet now when it comes out. Although I currently do not remember what the title of that book is. In between Fire and Bitterblue, I read Beach Read by Emily Henry. This is somewhere sort of between a like woman's fiction or chick lit book and an adult genre romance. Basically, the premise of this is that you have one main character, January, who is a woman's fiction / romance writer, dealing with the death of her father and the fact that upon her father's death, she found out that he had been having an affair while still married to her mother, and he leaves her the lake house where he used to go to see his mistress. And she's having a really hard time dealing with this. Her picture-perfect relationship breaks up, and she has a really bad case of writer's block, and she's running out of money, and she's super depressed. So finally she sort of hits rock bottom, and she goes to this lake house to clean it out and to buckle down and write a draft of her book so that her agent doesn't get mad and drop her. Then once she gets there, she discovers her new next door neighbor is her college rival from her writing program, who wrote pretentious upmarket literary fiction and always looked down on her writing projects and critiqued them really harshly. So she feels that they used to be rivals, and there's a lot of like tension there. But when they get to talking, it turns out that he also has a bad case of writer's block. So they decide to switch genres, and she's going to try to write an upmarket literary fiction book, and he's going to try to write a romance novel with a happy ending, in order to try to sort of break out of their writing ruts, and then whoever can sell their book first wins. But then in order to learn about each other's genres, they're also going to hang out a bunch together and either go on really depressing research trips or do fun rom-com stuff like going to carnivals or whatever. And it being a romance novel, I think you can figure out what happens from there. I really enjoyed this. I tend to really enjoy books about writers. I really liked this sort of competition dynamic changing into something else. And I really enjoyed the sort of meta quality where it was discussing what romance did for the main character, how it helped her, how reading it helped her, and how writing it helped her and allowed her to feel like she was helping other people. So it's definitely a great book for people who love writing or people who love books. With that said, while I was reading it, I felt like it was going to be one of my like top 3, top 5 romances of the year. It felt like it was up there with Well Met by Jen DeLuca or The Bromance Book Club or You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogle. But in comparison to those books, it definitely hasn't left as big of an effect on me. I don't remember what happened and how I felt about it nearly as well as I do with those other books. So while I really enjoyed this and I think it has a lot of humor and a lot of heart, I don't think it has left as much of a lasting impression on me as I was perhaps expecting it to. After that, I read We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. This is a short, sort of hard-hitting queer YA contemporary about a girl named Marin, and when the book opens, she has decided not to go home, not to go anywhere over the winter break, and has gotten permission to stay in the dorms by herself. And she thought it was a good idea, but then as soon as everybody leaves, she realizes how like painfully lonely and sort of not okay she is. But she knows that her friend Mabel, who was her best friend when she lived in California before she left for college, is coming to visit her and will be there for a day or two. And so she's sort of both looking forward to and dreading Mabel's visit because she hasn't talked to Mabel since her grandfather died, and she basically fled California without talking to anyone and hasn't talked to anyone since. Marin was basically raised by her grandfather, and upon her grandfather's death, she discovers things about him that she didn't know while she was alive, so it's almost sort of a similar theme to Beach Read, where she's questioning how well she actually knew this person who she loved very much and who was very important to her. There's not terribly much of a plot in this book. It's basically just that the arrival of Marin's friend forces her to confront all of the things that she's been avoiding, and so there's a lot of flashbacks to what happened in California right before she left, including her relationship with her friend Mabel taking a turn for the romantic. And so the book is basically a slow, thoughtful, melancholy exploration of mental health and grief, leading eventually into a moment of catharsis where the character realizes that eventually things are going to be okay. You know, life is going to go on. In terms of my personal taste, I liked this, but I didn't love it. I think this is a case where the cover does a pretty exceptional job of letting you know what the book is about and what the vibe of the book is going to be. If you're a plot-driven reader, I would steer clear of this one, but if you enjoy protracted character studies or protracted meditations on a theme, if you enjoy somewhat non-linear storytelling or dual timeline books, this could be a good one for you. Book number 5 was Real Men Knit by Kwana Jackson. There's like a weird number of dead parental figures in this wrap-up. So this book opens in the aftermath of the death of a woman named Mama Joy, who ran a knitting shop in Harlem where the main character Carrie grew up, and you know, since she was a kid she's hung out there, and then when she was a teenager she got a part-time job there that she's kept all the way through school and into young adulthood. But now that Mama Joy is dead, Carrie is worried that her 4 adopted sons will elect to close the shop and sell it and then sort of move on, and this huge part of her life will be gone. But then it turns out that the youngest son, Jesse, is willing to fight for it to stay open. None of his brothers really take him seriously because of all of them, he is the one with like the least amount of a stable career, but the shop is important to him and he wants to keep it open. And Carrie agrees to help even though she's had a crush on Jesse that she's pretty sure is unrequited for as long as she can remember. And it's a romance novel, so as she spends time there and helps to get the shop off the ground again, I'm sure you can imagine what happens next. As you can probably tell from the name of this channel, I like to knit myself, and so I keep an eye out for books where the fiber arts play some sort of a role, but this one was a little bit disappointing. My biggest problem with the book was that I just don't think it was written well, like on a prose level, a sentence level. I try to be lenient with books that I read in ebook and as far as like typos and mistakes go, but this went beyond typos and mistakes to sort of the sentence level prose, feeling like it was actively fighting my understanding, to the extent that I checked whether this book had been self-published because I wasn't sure if it had seen an editor at all. There's also some weird pacing stuff or like info dumps right near the beginning where like a character will be pouring a cup of coffee, and in the time that they're pouring the coffee you'll get like 4 paragraphs about everything that's ever happened to them in their life, and then they set the coffee pot down. And like, I feel like you can do that while you have your character like walking a mile or something, but in a gesture that's supposed to take you maybe 8 seconds, I don't know that I believe that you have time internally to go through all of that. I didn't find that convincing, and it sort of pulled me out of the story. With regards to the relationship, it kind of felt like I was being told rather than shown that the 2 people liked each other and were increasingly falling for each other. I didn't necessarily feel it myself, and it's kind of hard to give a romance top marks when you're not personally invested in the relationship. I also felt like the pacing of the relationship was kind of weird, like instead of gradually intensifying throughout the entire book, their feelings seem to stay the same for large stretches of the book, and then there's this huge grand gesture at the end which is sweet but doesn't necessarily seem warranted or justified by anything that came before. And so the development of the relationship, which is the most important element of a romance, felt uneven and kind of strange. For me though, I think the real highlights of the book were the moments where the community, both of the knitting store and the neighborhood as a whole, were portrayed. I found those moments really authentic and heartwarming and nice to read about. And additionally, I believe both of the leads and I think the entire supporting cast are people of color, and there's also representation for a family formed through the foster system and adoption. So I think it's always good to shout out diversity in romance. After that, I read The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and it was excellent. I read the short story that this was based on, I think about 2 years ago now, for my science fiction class in college, and I really enjoyed it. So when I saw that it was being made into a full novel, I was quite excited. Basically, I would describe this as a piece of actively anti-racist Lovecraftian horror, which is just a delightful thing to have in the world. The premise of this is basically that when cities reach a certain age or accrue enough of a sort of identity, they come to life, and the sort of soul or essence of the city is contained by an avatar, basically a person. But while these cities are being born, there's this sort of eldritch horror from another dimension that comes to try to eat them while they are weak and young. And as the city of New York comes into being, it turns out that there's not going to be just one avatar, but in addition to the main avatar, there will be 5 other avatars, one representing each of the boroughs. And so they all have to sort of find each other while this sort of creepy crawly thing from another dimension dimension tries to pick them off while they're isolated and weak. And this is really, really, really good. Essentially, my only problems with this came from mismanaged expectations, so I'm going to describe those now, not because I'm complaining or saying that these are bad things about the book, but because I want you to have the correct expectations when you go into it so you can enjoy it uncomplicatedly. I thought this was a standalone, and that was why I prioritized it over starting the Broken Earth trilogy, because I thought this was going to be a one and done. And as the book was going on, I realized that maybe it wasn't going to be a one and done, but I assumed that the subsequent books would be about other cities. That is also not correct. It's the first book in a trilogy, and the entire trilogy is going to be about New York, as far as I can tell. So while there definitely is an ending and there's resolution to one arc, there are unanswered questions at the end of the book and some major unresolved plot points at the end of the book because it's the first installment in a series, but because I was expecting it to be a standalone and then expecting it to be the first installment in an episodic series, I was sort of left unsatisfied by the ending, not because the ending is unsatisfied, but because I was expecting the wrong kind of ending. So go into this expecting the ending that comes in the first book of a trilogy that's all about one plot. Other than that, my only other problem with the book is that I would have liked to hear more from the representation of the borough of Queens, because in comparison to the other boroughs, I feel like she got like dramatically less screen time and development, and both from a sense of like aesthetic balance and because Queens is the borough to which I have like personal and familial connections, I wanted to hear more from her. But yeah, I really highly recommend this one. After that, I read The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, and this was also outstanding. 5 out of 5 stars, melted my heart. Oh my goodness. So this is about Linus, who is a caseworker at the Department for the Control of Magical Youth, and his job is basically to go to orphanages that have been set up to take in magical youth, children with magical powers, and make sure that they're being run appropriately and that the children are okay, etc. And he files his reports, and he is very by the book. He follows all the rules, and he doesn't question the rules because the rules are rules and rules are good, right? And he's so good at following the rules that the extremely upper management of the Department for the Control of Magical Youth sent him on a top secret assignment to an orphanage out on a remote island where they keep the especially dangerous magical children. And his assignment is, as usual, to assess the care of these children, but also to gather as much information as he can about their caretaker, Arthur Parnassus. While he's there, Linus basically begins to question whether following the rules is always the right thing to do, and whether he can open himself up to a different sort of life to the one that he's been living. This is quite possibly the cutest book in existence. Like, this book is so delightful that it kind of made me angry while I was reading it, if that makes any amount of sense. It has sort of whimsical, tongue-in-cheek kind of vibes. I was sort of reminded of like Douglas Adams or Terry Pratchett or Jasper Fforde in tone, and sort of the treatment of the bureaucracy basically that runs the society. I think the message at the center of the book, which is essentially that following the rules is only right if the rules themselves are morally correct, is a necessary and timely one. I think this could be a good crossover book to recommend to YA readers who are trying to graduate into adult, because while the main characters are adults, the supporting cast is these magical children, and because while it is an adult fantasy book, there's not anything too violent or too graphic that happens that I remember. But basically this book is pure sunshine. One of the magical children is this little green ball of slime named Chauncey, and Chauncey's greatest dream in life is to be a bellhop, and he like spends the book practicing to be a bellhop, and I don't even know how to explain how good that is. Like, it's so good. Just 11 out of 10, pure joy. It's also queer, it's magical, it's amazing. Okay, after that I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this was my 100th book of the year, so that is very exciting. And I also really enjoyed this book. I would give it about a 4.5 stars. This, if you somehow haven't heard about it up until now, is about the sort of famous and famously reclusive Hollywood starlet Evelyn Hugo recruiting a virtually unknown writer named Monique to write her biography. So she's like, I'm going to tell you everything. I've never told anyone these things before. I'm going to tell you. You're going to write a book. You're going to be very rich and famous. And so that's the sort of frame narrative, and within that you have Evelyn telling the story of her entire life, sort of broken up and structured around each of her famous 7 marriages. But because Evelyn's story takes place over much of the middle of the 20th century, the 50s and the 60s, she was not able to tell the world until now that she also had a long-term relationship with a woman. I really liked this. I was extremely emotionally invested. I cried a lot. My one criticism of this is that the pacing feels kind of uneven, but I understand that that's largely because the book is a person telling the story of their own life, and the way that you tell a story is you skip to the parts where there are conflict. You don't tell stories in the Western world, at least and for the most part, but not universally, but often, you don't tell stories where nothing is happening, where two people are just mostly content, living their lives together, having an okay time. So I understand why that is, but it was just sort of frustrating to me that whenever things were going okay for Evelyn and the woman that she was in love with, we would just be like, skip ahead 6 years, skip ahead 20 years. And especially towards the end of the book, when you get towards the end of Evelyn's life, you skip huge chunks of time, and you're basically just skipping from tragedy to tragedy. And so yeah, I was crying, but I was also a little bit like, well, come on now. Like, we just covered 30 years here in like 20 pages, when before we had like 200 pages for the 30 years before that. Like, so I get it, but first of all, on a critical level, I get sort of frustrated by life course narratives where when you are married to the person you want to be married to, your life is over and nothing interesting will ever happen to you again. For example, that's an example of a life course narrative that I'm not interested in. And second of all, on an emotional level, my favorite part of any romance is the two people who are together just sort of being happy and cute together, which you often don't get a lot of because, again, the story focuses on the conflicts. Anyway, especially towards the end, the elision of long periods of time was sort of grating on me a teeny tiny bit, and I know that it's possible to write a person's entire life where the gaps in time, the time that you skip, doesn't feel manipulative or rushed in that way. For an example, I would look at Elizabeth Gilbert's The Signature of All Things. You skip 40 years at one point in that book, basically, or 30 years, and it didn't bother me. I was like, sure. But at the end of the day, this is a historical fiction with a central character who is bisexual and who is also a woman who is sort of ruthlessly ambitious and willing to do almost anything to get what she wants. And so at the end of the day, I was always going to like it, and I did. Book number 9 was the play that I read, and this was Icebound by Owen Davis. This is a play that was written in 1923 and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1923. I read this because I was trying to do a reading vlog that I eventually abandoned, but I read this for that reading vlog. Hopefully there will be a successful version of that reading vlog coming out at some point in the future, if I can get it together. But basically this is a play set in Maine, and it opens at the deathbed of the matriarch of this family, and all of the rest of the family has gathered around to kind of to mourn this woman, but mostly to wait until her will is read, because all of them think that they could use the money and that they could use the money more than their siblings or relatives. But then when the old woman does die, she leaves the money to someone unexpected, and that sparks the conflict for the rest of the play. Overall, this was basically just okay for me. It had a plot and conflict and stakes, which I always admire in a book or a play when it has a well-made plot, because that is something that I struggle with in my own writing. So when I see a well-constructed arc like that, I do appreciate it. There's a really interesting female character in the play who I think would be interesting to study more closely or perhaps to play. At one point there's sort of a love zigzag, if that makes any sense. But there are also some decisions made, especially concerning two of the players in that love zigzag, that didn't really make sense to me, where a character would say one thing and then a few lines later they would change their mind and say the opposite, and they wouldn't convince me of the fact that they had actually changed their mind or that they were just bluffing the first time or whatever. It felt like they were just sort of contradicting themselves, but you know, that's a little messy. Content warning for one use of a racial slur, if that's something you're sensitive to, although overall, compared to some of the old Pulitzer Prize winning plays that I've read, this one has aged comparatively okay. Overall, I think this functions as a play, but it didn't do anything terribly special for me, so I would give it about 3 stars. And finally, the 10th book I read in September was Who is Vera Kelly by Rosalie Knecht. This is a sort of literary spy novel, kind of. Basically, this is about the central character, Vera Kelly, who works for the CIA, and she is on assignment in Argentina as the local government seems to be increasingly destabilizing and perhaps even to be on the brink of a coup. And then there's another timeline which, in alternating scenes, takes you through Vera's adolescence and young adulthood, her conflicts with her mother, her discovering her attraction to other women, and exploring the sort of underground gay scene in New York City in the 50s and early 60s. So this is a lovely historical fiction spy novel with a queer main character. I would definitely say this has more of an adventure plot than a mystery plot. I would give this 3.5 stars. I really, really liked it, but my rating system is sort of emotionally based once you get to the higher side of the ratings. So 4 stars and 5 stars are sort of two distinct feelings, and I didn't end up emotionally involved in this enough to give it a 4 or a 5 star, if that makes sense. And that could be because it's more on the literary end of things for a crime novel. So it's possible that the prose was not as sort of immediate and emotional, and that's what had me detached, or it could be the fact that the main character has sort of a very matter-of-fact voice herself. But either way, I didn't necessarily get my feelings tangled up in this one. But with that said, I really don't think there's anything wrong with it, and I also think that this is an iconic and beautiful cover. I did not know that this was a series when I started reading it, but apparently it is a series. I don't know how many books the series will have in it, but I'm expecting them to be fairly episodic rather than directly related to each other, so something to keep in mind. But yeah, this was a lovely way to spend an evening. I recommend it. Okay, and then really quickly, I just want to discuss some sort of broad strokes October reading plans. So there are basically 3 main kinds of things I want to read in October. I want to read Victorian literature in honor of Victober. I have a fair amount of Victorian literature on my physical TBR, including some Dickens books. I have an Elizabeth Gaskell, I have The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, and I have Carmilla by Sheridan, which I think would both fit the sort of spooky vibe of October. I also might reread Villette in order to make a video about some of my favorite things to analyze about Villette by Charlotte Bronte, although I don't know if I should take up one of my sort of chunky novel slots for the month with something that I've already read. If I can get my brain in gear to sort of complete projects that take more than 1 day to complete, I'm hoping to bring out some Victober content. So anyway, that is category 1, Victorian literature. Category 2 is I am basically really in the mood for historical fiction with usually a female lead and some kind of dark or mysterious or spooky element to it, and I have a ton of books like that on my TBR, and many of them are even set in the Victorian period to carry on the spirit of Victober, if not the sort of letter of the law of Victober. Currently, I am in the middle of the Confessions of Franny Langton, and I'm hoping to read other similar books over the course of the month. And category number 3 is another kind of book that I have a lot of on my TBR, and those are sort of queer witchy books, most of which are YA. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Halloween is coming up. I have a ton of them on my TBR, and I think this is the perfect time of year to read them. Some examples of those books would be Witches of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer, or perhaps the Brooklyn Brujas series by Zoraida Cordova. So those are my extremely general, very vague plans. And I think that's it for today. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite book that you read in September was, or what you are most looking forward to reading in October. And also, if you live in the US, please let me know what your plan to vote in the upcoming election is, because studies show that you are much more likely to carry through the process of voting if you have discussed your plans ahead of time, so please feel free to do that. If you liked this video, I do hope you'll consider subscribing, and I will see you again soon. But until then, I hope that everyone is staying happy, healthy, and safe, and I hope that somewhere out there is a great book waiting just for you. Bye!